Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to review how to factor and solve. Today's goal is to practice factoring techniques that we'll eventually use in solving systems of equations algebraically. So let's start with a basic GCF problem. So problem number 1 we'll say is GCF. So we could have a quadratic that comes out to x squared minus x equals 0 while we're trying to solve a system of equations, and we're going to have to remember GCF. So as you can tell, you can divide both of these terms over here by x. So you write the x on the outside, followed by the open parenthesis, and then you divide. So x squared divided by x is nothing other than x. And then x divided by x, anything divided by itself, is 1. And setting it equal to 0 stays the same. And remember, we have to do a t-chart and set each piece equal to 0. So x equals 0. And x minus 1 equals 0, and then solve. So we have x equals 0, that was 1. So we have x equals 1, and we have x equals 0. Those would be my two final answers. Another example that we could have is 2x squared minus 8 equals 0, and we'd take out a GCF of 2, divide each piece by 2, we'd be left with x squared minus 4. Now this is a GCF problem, but I kind of made it a little bit tricky where I included a GCF and a dots problem. So if you notice in here, this is a difference of two perfect squares. So we'll have a 2 out front, and then an x plus 2 and an x minus 2. And again, set each piece equal to 0. On the left side here, 2 equals 0, we can reject. X plus 2 equals 0 here, minus 2 on both sides, and we get negative 2. X minus 2 equals 0 on the right. Add 2 to both sides, and we get x equals positive 2. So this was a good example of GCF and dots. Okay? Now let's get into the problems where you're going to probably see most often, which are trinomials. So example number 3 will be the AM method. And the AM method we only use when the leading coefficient is 1. So I'll put LC for leading coefficient when the leading coefficient is 1. So an example could be something like x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. And we know that the leading coefficient in front of the x squared is 1, so we know we can do add multiply. So we want to find the factors that add to negative 5 that multiply to 6. So just for those that need help with this, we're going to put the y equals in our calculators, and we're going to put 6 divided by x. You put the number that is being multiplied, you put the m value here. So you go to the y equals, you put 6 divided by x, and you look at the table of values. So go to the table and start the table off at 1 and jot down the whole numbers that you see. So if you pause the video, grab your calculator, type in 6 divided by x into the y equals, and then go to your table and then meet me here. So you should have 1 and 6, 2 and 3, and then you should see a repeat again of 6 and 1. So that is when you know to stop. So really you have 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. So if you want to add to 5, or a negative 5, we know that 2 and 3 is going to multiply to 6, but it'll add to a positive 5. So you just have to remember that when you're multiplying to a positive number, you could also have a negative times a negative. So if you add negative 2 and negative 3, you'll get your add value of negative 5. So then your final answer here is just x minus 2 and x minus 3. Now, if we wanted to find the solutions, all we would have to do is have this equation set equal to 0, and nice t-chart. So set each piece equal to 0, x minus 2 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. Add 2 to both sides. Again, I know some of you can do this by hand, and that's okay. So, not by hand, I mean in your heads. So this is x equals 2, and this is x equals 3. Don't really need to see those steps, but if you need them, that's how you get them. All right, let's try another example. Okay, so for number 4, we have 9x squared plus 33x minus 60. And right away, you can tell that the leading coefficient is greater than 1, so we know the AM method is not going to work. So this is where I'd like to introduce a method called the AC method. And if you feel like using guess and test at this point, you totally can. But I feel for those that are struggling with guess and test, I'd like to go over this AC method in more detail. So the first thing that you want to do normally would be multiply the first term and the last term. That's the A and the C. But notice that this 9 times 60 is really large. I want to try to eliminate that really big number. So you want to try to not forget that we can take out a GCF first. So step 1 is always to look for a GCF. So let's do that. I believe you could take out a 3 out of this whole thing. So we'll make this 3x squared plus 11x minus 20. And although I took out a GCF, I didn't get rid of the number in front. There's still a number in front, so we still have to use AC. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the first term and the last term. We multiply those together, and that gives me negative 60x squared. It's still a relatively big number, but it's way smaller than multiplying 9 and 60 together. So once we look for the GCF, the second step was multiply A and C, or the first term and the last term. And then we're going to look at our table of values. So just like we did before, you're going to go to the y equals, and you're going to type in now negative 60 divided by x. And give me the table of values. So again, pause the video, grab your calculator, and then hit resume when you're ready. So you should have 1 and negative 60, 2 and negative 30, 3 and negative 20, 4 and negative 15, 5 and negative 12, and 6 and negative 10. Now, you could also have the reverse. You know, you could have a negative 60 and a positive 1, a negative 2 and a positive 30, right? But our goal is to look for things that add to this middle term. We want to see what adds to 11x. So I'm really focusing my attention on this term because I know that 4 plus negative 15, that is negative 11. But we want it to be positive 11. So all we would have to do is just switch the signs. And remember, we're rewriting this 11x. So we're writing it as negative 4x plus 15x. You really have to put those x's down because technically we're finding the factors of negative 60x squared. We just can't put that into the calculator to get the right answers. So x and x would have to go here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bring down our first term of 3x squared and bring down our last term of negative 20. And then we factor by grouping. Remember, group the first two, bring down the plus, and group the second two. And then we're going to take out a GCF. GCF out of the first two is x. And we're left with 3x minus 4. GCF of the second two is 5. And we're left with 3x minus 4. And these two are our common factor. Those get their own parenthesis as a GCF, followed by the numbers on the outside of the parentheses, x plus 5. So those are our factors. If we want to find the solutions, this would have had been set equal to 0. Then we set those equal to 0 and do a t-chart. Again, I'm sure you can do this in your head, so it's 4/3 and negative 5. Now, if you notice, I kind of ignored that 3. And the reason why I did that was because technically you really should have brought this 3 down here after you were done factoring. But when I do a t-chart with that, 3 equals 0 doesn't make any sense, so we'd have to reject it anyway. And I think these are going to be the only situations that you would actually see. All right, so the last question that I have for today is number 5. And that one will be 2x squared minus 9x plus 4. And as you can tell, the GCF is still, or not GCF, the leading coefficient is still greater than 1, but at this point I can't divide all terms by 2 because of this 9 here. So we're just going to have to go straight to AC. So we multiply the first and the last, and we get 8x squared. So again, we go to the y equals, and we do 8 divided by x, and we look at the table of values. Now, just to save time, the numbers you should get are 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. But also remember that you can multiply to a positive 8 with two negatives. So -2 and -4, and -1 and -8. So we want the pair that adds to this middle term, the -9. And that answer will be this pair right here. So again, we're rewriting the middle term as -1x minus 8x. And we're going to bring down the first term, and we're going to bring down our last term, and we're going to factor by grouping. Group the first two, group the second two, and bring down the minus sign. Now, I don't know that I mentioned this before, but these can be switched. You don't have to put the -1 first or the -8 first. You should still wind up at the same answer. So the GCF of these first two terms is simply an x, and the GCF of the second two terms is 4. So let's take out an x out of the first term, and we'd be left with 2x minus 1. And I'm going to take out a -4 of the second terms. And just be careful, when you do 4 divided by -4, it should be a -1. And -8 divided by -4 is a positive 2. So 2x minus 1. And then put it together like we did before, where this gets its own parenthesis and these two outside numbers go here. And again, if you wanted to find the solutions, it would have to have been set equal to 0. And then you just do a t-chart, setting each piece equal to 0. Now you can solve that on your own. You get 1/2 and you get 4. Those would be your final answers. All right, that's it for today of the review of factoring. If you have any questions, please let us know. Have a good one.